series. I'm Monica Tang from Earthkeepers, Christians for Climate Justice, and I'll be your moderator this evening. I just have a few housekeeping items to cover before we get started. So you're currently in listen-only mode, and this webinar is being recorded as part of our mandate of providing climate education for Christian audiences around the country. So this will be made available on our YouTube channel and our website afterwards. Feel free to turn off your camera or just check to make sure that it's turned off if you don't want that showing up in the recording. So next slide, please. We are Earthkeepers, Christians for Climate Justice, a citizen-led ecumenical group in Vancouver, Coast Salish territories, living into a biblical vision for ecology, love of neighbor, and climate justice. And to get a sense of where everybody else is linking in from, I think we have the privilege today of having people link in from different parts of Metro Vancouver and possibly different parts of BC or across the country. Feel free to type into the chat box which church or denomination you're a part of and perhaps where you're located, if that helps folks. If that helps orient folks. Next slide, please. This spring, we launched a webinar series called Hope in the Midst of Crises. We started with examining the linkages, similarities, and differences between the current COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis. That was the focus for our first webinar. The second webinar then shifted towards looking at what a just renewal past the pandemic could look like, and we outlined the main elements of a Green New Deal for Canada. If you've missed both of those webinars and would like to view them, they're available on the Earthkeepers website and also on the YouTube channel. Both of these webinars, next slide please, both of these webinars are building up to this one, which is focused on putting our faith into action. We've named this one Civic Engagement for Climate Justice, which focuses on translating knowledge into action. And today we have the pleasure of having two guests here with us who will give us some concrete examples about how we can do that through working in advocacy and through civic engagement. Next slide, please. So today, I'll introduce you to our two panelists who are friends and allies of our work here at Earthkeepers in pursuing climate advocacy and climate justice. They will lead our panel discussion, and after the panel discussion, we will have a time of question and answer, time permitting, which gives you the opportunity to bring forward any questions that you've been thinking about and contemplating, and probably a lot of questions that our panelists would be able to answer with their wealth of experience. We'll just then close with some announcements and some next steps for you to stay engaged in civic action for climate justice moving forward, and we'll have a closing prayer. So let me just start by introducing our two panelists. You may have seen them when we were advertising for the webinar, but today we are thrilled to have with us Karri Munn-Venn. Carrie is a senior policy analyst at Citizens for Public Justice. She has many hats. She's a farmer, she's a knitter, she's a climate justice advocate. Carrie has a background in international development, and at Citizens for Public Justice, she has led policy work on campaigns on poverty eradication and climate justice. In 2017, she was a part of the North American Christian delegation to COP23, which is the international climate change process led by the UN. Carrie has a BA in political science from York University and an MA in international studies from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. She lives on the unceded territories of the Algonquin, Huron-Wendat, and Anishinaabe in West Quebec. Several years ago, we've had the opportunity to partner with Earthkeepers by organizing a local event here to support their Give It Up for the Earth campaign. Our second panelist is Christine Boyle. Christine is a local face to some of you who may live in the Metro Vancouver area. Christine is a first-term city councillor with One City Vancouver. She is a community organizer, a climate justice activist, and an ordained United Church minister. And Councillor Boyle has previously served as both the Minister of Community Life at Canadian Memorial United Church here in Vancouver. She's done national climate justice organizing among diverse faith communities, including at COP21, at the Vatican, and with Faith and the Common Good. Christine was born and raised in unceded Coast Salish territories. She has a BSc in Urban Agriculture and First Nation Studies from UBC and a master's in Religious Leadership for Social Change from the Graduate Theological Union School in Berkeley, California. And we had the pleasure of connecting with Christine in her previous role with Fossil Free Faith. So we have a wealth of experience and knowledge between our two panelists, and we're thrilled to have them with us here today. So if we can just shift into the panel discussion, I'll just invite Carrie to present. As soon as we can get Carrie unmuted.
Hello. One of the tremendous joys of having just moved to a more rural area is that our internet, of course, is a little bit less predictable. So I'm hopeful that that's the extent of the challenges that we're going to have. And I do apologize in advance if we do run into more trouble. So there we go. So I just wanted to say how excited I am to be here. Often I get the opportunity to speak to church groups and school groups and others. And usually we start with kind of what is climate change? What's going on? What are the big issues? And then after we've worked through all kinds of science and how are we meant to respond as Christians and all kinds of different things like that, then we get to, so what can we do? But having, being here with you guys tonight and being in this third webinar of the series, I was thrilled that Monica said, okay, we just want you to get right to the action piece. So thank you for that. I want to just briefly introduce Citizens for Public Justice. I've scrolled through the list of participants and recognize a few people, so I'm thrilled that you're here. Monica, I'll have you know you have a few people in Ottawa. I've noticed some from the Kitchener-Waterloo area, which is close to where I grew up. And I'm sure there are others that I haven't seen, so we're grateful for the participation. But Citizens for Public Justice is a national organization of members inspired by faith to act for justice in Canadian public policy. We have three main areas of focus. Climate justice is one of them. Poverty eradication in Canada is, well, usually listed as the first, though I speak to climate first, and refugee rights, which of course are all interconnected and have all of the issues impact one another and play out together. And I've had the privilege of working with CPJ as a staff member since 2008, initially on our poverty file, and for the last, I guess, 8 years on ecological justice, climate change, and related issues. Advocacy. Advocacy is, as we understand it, just acting or speaking in favor of a policy, cause, or idea. Political advocacy is when we're specifically working to change government policy or priorities or legislative actions. What's interesting though is it doesn't have to, advocacy doesn't necessarily have to be oriented towards government. Of course, I work for a national public policy organization, so when I sat down to put some notes together for this evening, I had at least 3 letters to cabinet ministers open on my desktop, because that's the realm that I operate in. But it's, I think, really important to remember that you know, there's that, you know, right now, a lot of us are in sort of back to school mode. And I know some of the most important advocacy I've done in the past has been when situations are developing in schools. And I realized that despite tremendous administrators and teachers, the interests of my kids aren't that I think they should be. So that's when I speak to teachers or to principals. And that's, I think some of us do that kind of thing so often that we don't actually think of it in the same category. I'm going to take the risk of telling a little story, though I am really conscious of time. One of the first experiences I remember in being actively engaged in advocacy took place in my home church in Elora, Ontario. I'd moved away to university, but I received a letter, and it was an invitation to vote. I can't remember if it was the board of managers or elders or something, but all of the adults in the church were eligible candidates anyway. So we had a list of everybody. And one of the first things that struck me was that the men were all listed first, and then their wives, and then their children. But what was really striking was that some of these children were people my age, and all the young men were listed first, and then the young women followed. And I was just so bothered by the sexism of the way that this list had been organized, and so much so that I wrote to the minister about it, and I said, this is not okay. I can't remember how the issue was resolved in the church, but I do remember afterwards learning that it was my mother, based on her own inclinations, not any directives from board or session or whatever, who'd put the list together. So it was a difficult and ended up being, it sort of challenged sort of what are some of our fundamental beliefs and
Please bear with us. We'll just try to message Carrie to see if she can link in again.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you. Please go ahead. I think we may have missed a couple of sentences. If you were in the middle of a sentence, we might have just missed the last couple. So
all right,
no rush. No rush. We'll just add another minute.
All right, I've relocated, so hopefully my connection will last a little bit better. What I was saying was that being outraged with this letter that I received from my church, I wrote to the minister, only to later find out that it was my mom who'd put the list together, not by any directives from the church, but through her own inclination. So I wanted to share that really to make the point that advocacy doesn't always have to take place in the context of political leaders or that kind of thing. Advocacy it's when you just speak up for something that you believe in, and often the most important and impactful advocacy takes place within our families, within our faith communities, and within our neighborhoods. There you go. Sorry, I ran up the stairs when I got disconnected there. So I was going to move that to, oh, and I've also included on the slide, and I think that this will probably be circulated with some notes coming from Monica later on, but CPJ has an advocacy toolkit that will go in a lot more detail to some of the points that I'm going to raise this evening, but that's a good resource that's available to anyone on our website. So what makes for good advocacy? If we could move to the next slide. There's three main pieces that I want to highlight. There's all kinds of details, but really the first is, I say knowledge, but it's really just being aware of the issue that you want to speak to, of the concern. A bit of the why it matters probably is helpful too. The second piece is clarity, just being really sure, not just about what you're concerned about, but what you want to see, what's the change that you want to see. And finally, and this I think is the most critical piece, and it's about relationships. It's relationships with the people that you're working with, those in your networks. It's relationships with the people that you're going to be targeting with your advocacy. I don't really like that word, but I haven't come up with a better one. And a big part of this really is being present. So participating in meetings and events with colleagues and others who share your concerns, and also being present in the spaces where those that you want to influence are also present, because this allows people to get to know you. It builds trust, and it also gives you an opportunity to understand those people that you want to reach with your advocacy a little bit better. What matters to them? What do you have in common? What are your points of common concern or connection? So I had another story, but I think I'll save it for a little bit later, because I know that we don't have a whole lot of time. But I really did want to reinforce the idea that even when we don't previously know too much about an elected representative or even a church leader that we want to influence, there's really a lot of opportunities if we look for them. And there's simple things like community events or coffee hours and that kind of thing. And sometimes it does involve sort of putting yourself out there, but that's okay. And there's just two final points that I wanted to make on relationships. And that is, the first one is that school administrators, church leaders, political representatives are all human, just like us. And a sort of a second piece to that is, I believe that all of them enter into their roles with a sincere desire to make a difference, to make a positive impact. I mean, I know every once in a while we see those people who clearly got to where they are with a lot of ego and other things, but I think, and I try to remind myself of this, especially when I'm engaging with a member of parliament or a cabinet minister who I disagree with, whose perspective I find really difficult, but to really genuinely believe that they entered their role with good intentions. And the second thing the last thing I wanted to say about relationships is that working collaboratively and in relationship with others can also be really valuable, especially if you get clear on what your shared message is. And that's not only about what the problem is, but what is the solution that you're proposing? Because one of the things that we found is that often, and I'll use the political context as an example, when there are too many things that are seen as competing demands, it's really easy to be dismissed. Well, if you guys can't even agree amongst yourselves, how should we go about addressing your concerns? So that's a piece there. I want to take just a couple more minutes now to talk about what makes for an effective advocacy campaign. And if we can go to the next slide, please. It's sure that phone calls, letters, and meetings are important advocacy tools, and really that's kind of the bread and butter of what we do in the advocacy that we have. But when you can infuse that work with some creativity, with collaboration, and with creating connections, there's real potential to amplify the influence that you can have. So I want to talk about two campaigns. And the first one is one that Monica mentioned up the top. And I just noticed a few people introducing themselves in the chat, and I know they participated in this as well. So we can go to the next slide. And this is our annual Give It Up for the Earth campaign. And this is something that happens during the period of Lent every year. So roughly mid-February to the end of March, give or take a week. And this is something that we've described as our Faith in Action Climate Justice campaign. It's hosted and customized in communities across the country, and it's built around two pieces. The first is a personal pledge, which is something that we invite people to consider what they're going to do to reduce their personal or household greenhouse gas emissions. And the second is a postcard that most years, I think there was one exception, has been targeted to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. So the first couple of years to Minister Catherine McKenna. I think our third year we addressed it to Prime Minister Trudeau, and this year to one of your Vancouver MPs, Jonathan Wilkinson. And it's interesting because we believe quite strongly at CPJ that while personal action to address climate change is really important, it is not enough. We can all do all the little things, but what we really need is systemic change to address the scale of the problem. But by inviting people to make a personal pledge, one, there's a sense of accountability and integrity. There's a sense of agency, and that helps to create hope. And also, I think it makes it easier for the recipient to hear more about what we want them to do. To say, so this is what I'm going to do, but I need you to help us collectively make this change. So that's a campaign that we've run for 4 years now. This year, of course, as with everything this year, hit a bit of a hiccup because of when the pandemic began, though I know that there are still a lot of communities that are looking at how they can pick it up. And we're starting to consider already what that's going to look like in 2021. And then just very, very briefly, because I know I have passed my time now, if we can go to the last slide, I wanted to mention an initiative called For the Love of Creation. And this is a national collaboration of churches, faith-based organizations, for now mostly sort of in Christian circles, though we're working to expand that out. And it's really that as people of faith, we believe that we're called to respond meaningfully to the climate crisis, and that this is, you know, in 2020, we're entering a critical decade, and we want to come together. And there's a lot of different entry points: theological reflection, community conversation, and also a political advocacy, which is, of course, the piece that I'm most involved in. And what I meant to put it on this slide, but I'll pop the, we have a petition open right now, addressed to the Government of Canada, calling on increased climate ambition, investment in a just transition, implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and support to the Global South, both to address climate change and to help with pandemic recovery. So just really briefly in conclusion, be clear on the change you want to see, not just what you're concerned about. Build relationships, work collaboratively, and just keep swimming. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. That was, I really appreciated how you also emphasized the focus on building personal relationships, and especially as we're moving towards an age of gathering and meeting online, it is much easier sometimes to hide behind a computer screen and to see these things from a slightly depersonalized perspective, but to remember that as followers of Christ, we are called to love and engage with people on the basis of their as fellow sort of image bearers of God, and based on their humanity, and not just from the perspective of like labels, or, you know, just because people may have a different perspective or a different ideology than one that we may be, you know, used to. And in terms of the two campaigns that Carrie has mentioned and some ongoing actions, we'll cover this more in the next steps in the announcement section, but we'll also send out a list of civic actions that have been mentioned in the webinar today to all the participants, so that we can stay engaged and participate in things that are ongoing, and lend our voices and support ongoing campaigns for climate justice. All right, and our next panelist is Christine Boyle, and you know, it's really interesting because when we first met Christine, we met her in the role of being with Fossil Free Faith, and now that you're inside the system, so to speak, inside the local system at the City of Vancouver, we're just looking forward to just hearing your perspectives, and you know, coming from someone who has been on the advocacy side, and now you're also in this system where you have the opportunity to influence policy. So I'll just turn the mic over to Christine and just check that you're unmuted. And yes, you are.
Yes,
go ahead.
Sure. And also just delighted to have been invited here. As Monica said, I was born and raised, I am speaking to you from the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am delighted to get to skip past convincing you of the science, and as Carrie said so well, go right to how best to advocate for change. And I know there's a mix of folks from the Vancouver region and across the country, so there are some specifics about what Vancouver is doing and advocacy on that front that I think is helpful, that I'm happy to speak to as an example if folks want later, but I'm going to kind of take a step bigger and start with the the question of how best to advocate for change in these crises we face. And I think there'll be some overlap with the webinars that the speakers that you've heard from before. The first piece that I think is so crucial in the question of how best to advocate is to make sure that we are, as leaders and participants in this work, continuing to connect the dots, connecting the dots between climate change and inequality, between climate change and racism, between climate change and Indigenous rights, between climate change and migrant justice, jobs, and more and more. I think it's important not only because the real systemic solutions that we need to have these issues connected. It's also important because it helps more people see their way into this issue rather than siloing the challenges that we face and all working just on our own piece of the puzzle. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting we all have to fight every fight, but I think in the piece that we're doing, it strengthens our work and it strengthens our movements to be recognizing, you know, the environmental movement for decades has been very white, and it's made it less effective as a movement. So how are we looking at the, you know, the role of white supremacy in historically in the environmental movement, and bringing more people in and looking at whose voices are being lifted up, looking at what solutions are being centered and where that knowledge comes from. So, you know, and I think that our movements are getting this, and I in particular see young leaders understanding this as so obvious that they're pushing us all to have a better understanding. But I also remember many conversations where I've been told, where I've heard folks saying, you know, stop complicating it. Like, why does it have to be everything? Why can't we just fight on this one piece, and, you know, then we'll solve income inequality after that, and then we'll do this other piece. But this needs to be first. So I knowing many of the names in the chat, know a lot of folks understand this, and I think it can't be said enough that the ways that these things intersect with one another are making the crisis worse, and they need to be part of the solution. And the Green New Deal is a great example of bringing these issues together in a broad movement that helps us move forward. The second key piece, I think, in terms of strong advocacy is putting stories before statistics. So my partner is a policy person, spent decades at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we used to have these sort of debates. He'd show me his slides for a talk he was giving, and I'd be like, there's so many graphs, maybe fewer graphs. I do think it's so important that our climate effort be grounded in the science, and particularly in terms of the scale of urgency and ambition that we need to be clear about the scientific realities and have that inform our action. And our work, as Carrie said, in speaking to knowledge, can be deeply informed by the policy work that's happening and the solutions that are possible and that are out there. We're not actually lacking in solutions to these challenges. And on the advocacy piece, I think it strengthens the work, and it's a key piece that I see people of faith being able to bring to root our work in people and in personal stories, to paint a picture for folks of what that better life looks like on the other side of tackling climate change, for themselves, for their communities, for their country and beyond. Another piece I think we get to in centering stories over stats or talking about narrative is being able to help people understand the co-benefits of tackling climate change. So, you know, there are health benefits, there are benefits in terms of the kinds of communities that we build. Certainly at a local level, I see that so clearly. And I think, you know, folks in our communities, but also media and decision makers respond to stories. They have likely, hopefully, heard the science and seen the terrifying pictures of the color of the sky throughout California. So helping move people along in a kind of solutions-focused, story-focused way is really important. And again, like I say, I am an eternal optimist. I think this is a huge strength that people of faith and communities of faith bring to broader climate justice movements, is that we are story people. And then I often see Christians going into these spaces and sort of shying away from those stories. And I know this from myself, that we sort of have to, I put up a different screen, like I'm tough and I know the numbers. And I just want to reiterate what a strength I think that tradition of storytelling is to our movement. So the third piece in how best to advocate, I think, is thinking about a kind of ladder of engagement. So often in climate work, we think about a spectrum between personal change and systemic change. I think that's one helpful model in thinking about a theory of change and moving people, meeting people where they're at and moving them along that spectrum from personal to systemic, and holding space for both at the same time. So thinking about what changes people can make, but never just staying there. I actually think it's demoralizing to know the scale of the crisis and then have the solutions that are presented to you be so tiny and out of scale with the actual problem. I think that kills people's motivation rather than giving them a thing they can do, because people understand that the problem is bigger than my light bulbs or how I got to work yesterday. So holding both of those pieces, I think, is important. And it's not just about whether you're advocating for individual personal changes or government changes. I also think there's kind of a depth of that advocacy. So here's me like making a physical graph with my hands, but there's a scale between the personal change and the systemic change. And then I think the ladder of engagement is about how people show up to it. So the easy way in might be showing up after worship to an educational event, or signing a petition that is circulated. That's a kind of first step for many people, that they understand the scale of the issue and here's something that they can do to start to participate. And then our work as organizers and as leaders in this is to help them figure out how to keep moving up that ladder of engagement. What does it look like after you've attended a couple interesting educational events to help organize one in the congregation, or to think about who else in your world might be interested in this and organize something there, or sign a petition and then bring people together to show up at the office of an MLA, or engage in nonviolent civil disobedience against an infrastructure project that you maybe learned about, signed a petition about. So I think that's a helpful way to think about how we welcome people in, meet them where they're at, find entry points that are accessible, because not everybody's first step is going to be getting arrested at the Kinder Morgan terminal. And then we think about what are the steps that we build upon to empower people further, to give them space to be thinking in a bigger way, and keep expanding the work. So I'm sure also out of time. I know, again, from seeing some of your names, there are lots of examples of what you all have been involved in. And I had written a bunch out, but you know them and I'm sure we'll get there. So I'll pass it back to Monica for now.
Thanks, Christine. And I really liked how you were also specific, and you talked about the spectrum of engagement, from learning to taking the small steps towards education, and perhaps signing a petition, perhaps writing a postcard, and then scaling up those actions. So I personally found it very helpful to see that there's a spectrum in which we can engage with people. And that reminds me of when when we work in discipleship, when we work in education, we are meeting people where they are. We're also encouraging them not to stay where they are and encouraging them to sort of move along in that journey. So because everybody has been very conscientious about time today, which I really appreciate, we do have time for questions. So I've mentioned in the chat box that if you have any questions for either Carrie or Christine, or a general question that for both of them to answer, please feel free to type that into the chat box and we'll start a queue. And to give everyone just a couple of moments just to think and to ask a question. Maybe we can start with a question that we've been wrestling here with at Earthkeepers. As I've mentioned, we are an ecumenical group of Christians living in Metro Vancouver, and we've been at a couple of different churches where there's been some different perspectives and different starting points about advocacy and the role that advocacy has in our faith. So one of the things that we've just been wrestling with and thinking about over the past couple of years are what are some of the barriers or reservations in your mind that people have about advocacy, and in your experiences, what are some helpful responses or helpful ways that we can engage with people to encourage them to act, despite their reservations, or to invite them to a place to move beyond their reservations about, ooh, this is kind of, this is politics, and I'm not used to, politics as a Christian, and I'm not sure about the role of politics in my faith.
I'm happy to give a short answer and pass it back to Carrie.
That sounds great.
The first thing I think you touched on really well, Monica, is that there is a sense, I hear this in faith communities, that politics is kind of dirty, or that for a variety of reasons we shouldn't go there. So the first response I have to that comes from kind of a pragmatic charitable status position, which is I think it's helpful to distinguish between partisan politics and political engagement. And I think, from an organizational position, lots of nonprofits or churches are probably right to avoid engaging in partisan politics, in that they shouldn't be necessarily specifically encouraging members to support one party or one candidate over another. But political engagement is really important because it's one piece of how change works. And so I think we can't focus entirely on it. I will say, as someone who sits at those tables, it's not enough to just vote and then kind of let our leaders go and make all of the decisions. It's important that we keep engaging with them and pushing them, and that should happen from every place. And so we can't just do it, and we can't avoid it either. It's just one of the pieces of how change works. And if our effort is to tackle this crisis, then we need to figure out how we dabble in all of it. And so, I mean, I'm happy to speak more to that, but I suspect people understand it. The difference between partisan engagement in terms of supporting a specific party and political engagement on an issue is maybe a helpful distinction for people, and then painting a picture of that being one piece of the overall change, I think, helps people better understand. As Carrie said, well, our decision makers are also human beings, and they are lobbied and impacted all of the time by other human beings, and if we're not pushing that they should tackle climate change, they're not hearing those voices. And I can guarantee you they're hearing from voices who are saying not to do this, or from vested interests that don't want to lose money on investments that they've made, et cetera. So I do think it's a moral imperative to see that as one piece of the work, even if it's outside of the comfort zones that we've grown accustomed to.
Thank you. And I'll just open the invitation to Carrie to see if there's anything else, see if there's anything you'd like to add, or anything, other thoughts that you have on the question you'd like to share.
Well, I think, I mean, Christine is so beautifully articulate on all of these issues that I think she's responded to that really well. But I think there is this sense sometimes in our faith communities that we're going to be polite and let's all just get along. And I think if we invite people to really deeply look at the lessons of Scripture, the life of Jesus was not just getting along, right? And I think we do have to be careful in the ways that is framed, because it can be quite challenging to the ways that people understand their faith and their role as Christians. But I think, and people from other faiths as well, but I think if we really look at what was happening in the formation of our faith traditions, it really is about, well, what matters and what's important, and is kind of getting along to, I've lost the expression now, but is that what really matters? Or do we want to look at what's the future we want to, what's the legacy we want to leave for our children? What is the role that we feel that God calls us to take? Yes, I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Both excellent, both excellent thoughts. We have two questions from the audience, and I'll just go in the order in which people have been typing them into the chat box. So I will just, invite Laura Chen to unmute her mic and just to pose a question. It doesn't look like you've posed it specifically to Carrie or Christine, so we'll treat it as a question that either of them can answer. So Laura, I'll just invite you to unmute your mic and share your question.
Yeah, thank you. Any specific like talking points or specific ways to communicate with people of faith or your congregation for them to understand why advocating for climate justice is an important part of our faith? Because I don't think a lot of people realize why caring about climate change is so relevant to our role as being Christians, and also how we can tie that conversation to inspire people to also become civically engaged. I was just wondering if there were specific ways that you've noticed worked really well when you've communicated with your community or with your congregation.
Thanks, Laura. I'll just leave this space open to Christine or to Carrie, whoever wants to jump in and respond first, and we'll go from there.
Do you want to go first on this one, Carrie?
Sure, I'll try and be brief. Again, I think there's a lot. I mean, if we look to Scripture, there is a lot that we can see. The laments of the prophets. There's the even in the creation story, where it created it and it is good, and for God so loved the world. With that passage, we focus so heavily on that He gave His only Son that I think we jump over why. And it's this tremendous love and compassion. And I think even when we look at the covenant with Noah, it was with all of creation, right? And I think there's a tendency to separate ourselves from creation, and that when we look at being, that we are part of the created world, and as such, we and all of creation are deeply loved. I think that's, for me, has been a starting point, and one that might invite some further exploration.
Well, I think that was beautifully said. So I will just add, in my experience as well, role modeling and testimonials have played a very powerful role in how I've seen my own faith community move on climate issues. In part, I think we're so lucky in that we come from these communities where people care about one another deeply, and so there's an even larger opportunity for them to listen to one another across kind of difference or indifference, as the case may be. So I have seen within my faith community, also in bringing guest preachers in, or in broader communities, seeing people of faith witness to another person of faith living that out in a really tangible way around climate, and sharing that story and making those connections be a way that people better understand the issue and better understand the possibility that they might also step up and take action in that way or in a different way on the issue. So I think those pieces of the relationships that exist, and role modeling, and if for folks who are in positions of leadership, I think that means inviting in those stories of people who are doing this work and living it out, so that others can hear it and others can see what that might look like for themselves, is a powerful way to bring more people in.
Thanks. Our next question is from Deborah, and I'll invite Deborah to unmute her mic, but it sounds like it's a question around, where do we prioritize our efforts between local engagement and potentially national and international involvement? So great question, one that we often sort of wrestle with in our work with churches and Christians here in local Metro Vancouver. So yeah, go ahead, Deborah. Please unmute yourself and present your question.
Yes, thank you. I guess my concern comes out of teaching. I teach in a Christian university, and I find that students are often completely overwhelmed by climate issues, justice issues, and any relationship between the two. And so my question is, how have the panelists found is the best way forward to engage young people, especially? I guess I'm thinking of people of, between the ages of 18 and 22, that they feel they've got some kind of agency. Is it by encouraging them, thinking back to what Christine was talking about, is it by encouraging them to do personal things or local things, or getting involved in something national, or becoming spokespeople involved with international efforts? I'm wanting to encourage agency, and I find that even when Christian students have gotten as far as understanding that there is a connection between these issues, they can feel completely unable to act because they're just so overwhelmed. So I'd be interested to know what you found in terms of the relationship between the local and the national, international, in terms of enabling people to feel they can actually do anything.
I think I have a really short answer to that. And it really is to encourage people to go where their heart moves them. I have a background in international development. When my kids were young, it felt really important to be looking more at what was happening federally. But then in our day-to-day, there's all kinds of times when it's things that are happening more locally. And I think it's acknowledging that we can't do all the things all the time, but find that piece and recognize that when we are working at this together, as much as possible, when we're pushing in the same direction, I think that's really powerful. But I would want to encourage young people to find that action or that movement or that moment or that issue that inspires them to act for change, and do that with passion and conviction. And if everybody were to do that, I think we'd do pretty well. That was longer than I thought it was going to be.
Can I make a comment in response?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm very struck by how that feeds into the notion of the body of Christ, that we're not all called to do the same things, and that different people's gifts can lead them to different actions. I really find that helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for the great question. Next in the queue, we have Joe, getting right to the heart of things. So Joe, I'll go ahead and invite you to unmute your mic and pose your question.
Thanks. So I just wondered if the panelists would comment on the fact that most decision makers, politicians probably, see church communities as not very concerned about the kinds of issues you're talking about. A recent book out of Carleton University with academics at the University of Toronto and the university up here in Ottawa talked about how faith communities have been affected around issues like sex education in school and abortion rights and those kinds of things. So maybe we need to hear some of your input on how the minorities of people in the faith communities who are moving ecological justice issues might be effective in moving those our institutions of faith-based communities to be seen to be authentic when we want to speak to decision makers in business or politics. What can we do about the church communities that we're part of?
It's a great question. And also nice to hear your voice, Joe. I think, you know, much as it, like politics, probably feels like a dirty word, I think the language you used in the chat around being power brokers is a kind of reality of how a lot of political decision making happens. And it gets to, I think, movement building that people of faith can play a valuable role in. Often, the way I see decisions get made at political tables is a weighing of public opinion on the issue, and too often, for my liking, I see politicians make decisions based on where public opinion currently is rather than where we need to go. And it's a calculation of power. And so I think about that when I think about national organizing that's happened around, for example, the Green New Deal or other key issues, where part of the calculation in terms of a theory of social change is needing to show elected officials that enough people care about this issue that they need to do something about it, or you know, or it will matter in terms of their next election or re-election. And so that's part of the tool that petitions lean on, is being able to show a large number. It's part of the tool that coalitions or the approach that coalitions use when CPJ and others join in like a national coalition for climate action, and the goal is to show as broad a group with as many representative organizations as possible. It's all communicating power to decision makers so that they feel that. And so again, it's not everybody's comfort zone, but I do think it is some of the reality of how politicians make decisions. And the largest kind of mobilizations of faith communities haven't been advocating on this issue. And so I do think it's valuable to be finding ways for people to join in and organizing and mobilizing in a way that pushes, that mobilizes real power and then pushes for real decisions to be made based on that power, to and to not shy away from the role that power plays and how our systems are built and decisions are made.
And I think that's a really important place too, where advocacy within our faith communities really matters. If your faith leaders aren't speaking to issues the way that you believe they should, that's an opportunity. So speak out as a person of faith, as I know you always do, Joe. But also, I think the working within the structures that we are a part of is also really important.
Thanks. Just a quick housekeeping note that I've also asked in the chat box is that we have 2 people left in the queue. We are also close to 7 o'clock, so I just wanted to let people know that I'm aware that it's 7 o'clock in Pacific Standard Time. It may be close to 10 o'clock in Ottawa Standard Time. So if you feel that if you need to hop off for the evening, that's totally fine. We will have a recording up on our YouTube channel and on our website afterwards for you to catch up, and we'll also be sending a list of the actions. And if you are able to stick around and to hear the last 2 questions, I certainly invite you to stick around for another 10 or so minutes, just so we can get to the last 2 questions that people have answered. And we'll also just share some information about a prayer campaign that we have at Earthkeepers. So the next person we have in the queue is Michelle. So Michelle, I just it's your turn. So I'll just invite you to unmute your mic and pose your question.
Yeah, thanks for everything that both Christine and Carrie have mentioned. Carrie, if you remember, we worked together a long time ago. My problem is, can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. My problem is that I feel that the religion itself has been recuperated by what I call pelvic morality. Everything around pelvic morality is what it seems to identify what religion is. And it's, to me, it's a complete false presentation, but you leave it up to the abortion issue down in the States. My question is, in terms of positive perspective, symbols are very important. Symbols give us a certain breadth, it gives us motivation and things like that. Do you have any symbols are there many symbols that are used in this process for the whole question around ecology to try and bring about change? Thank you.
You know, this is a question I don't have an easy answer to, and I'm going to keep pondering. But part of my initial thought is it is both a joy and a challenge of our increased awareness of the diversity around us. That it is harder and harder to find any one symbol that brings us all together, so there's nothing that jumps to mind right now that I think this is what, you know, if only we all had this one thing and we could all connect to it. I think again, it's hard, but and I think it's not the reality for us anymore in our faith communities or more broadly. And so I just am wrestling with what does it look like to have people bring their symbols and their stories into a kind of mosaic to know what moves everyone else, but not need it to be the same thing for everyone. I don't mean that to be a cop-out answer. Maybe Carrie has something more specific, but that's what is standing out to me right now. And the cross, I feel like the cross is supposed to be the answer. Did I get that wrong? To Carrie.
Yeah, no, I had a less specific answer before you spoke, so thanks for that, Christine. There's something in what Christine said that reminded me of an invitation that we often share in speaking with people about Christian engagement and climate change. And that's an invitation to begin with a place that you love. And as Christine says, it's not going to be the same symbol for everyone, but if we root ourselves with it, because in my experience, anytime I've asked that question, somebody has that place either where they went as a child or, you know, the place that they go to sort of get away from all of the struggle, where there's a deep and profound connection with creation and with creator. And so it isn't at all a single symbol, but a shared sense, I suppose. But that is a really great question, Michelle, and I'm going to think on it some more as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Excellent question. And the last question that we have in the queue is from Gladys, and it is about sort of where do we start? It's a huge issue. Where do we start? And there's just an example of, you know, what do we do about current infrastructure projects that are on the books that are, planned for construction, like the Trans Mountain Pipeline that was previously owned by Kinder Morgan, now owned by us taxpayers. What should we do about that? So Gladys, if you're still here, I'll just invite you to unmute your mic and directly pose your question.
Hello. I am so glad that you folks are working on this, because for me, the problem is so huge, it kind of paralyzes me. I don't know what to do. So it's nice to get some suggestions and some ideas. I'm terrified when I think about places like Bangladesh and what's going to happen, which is going to happen. So what can we do? So I don't know. So you keep talking and keep giving us ideas, and you're the inspiration for the nation, right? So what do we do with good practical projects that may harm the climate and the overall, but that make so many good possibilities for people like the Indigenous people out west? I don't know. I guess that's my question.
I'm going to get a little bit political in answering this because I have encouraged you all to do that too. I think on the infrastructure project piece, the science is very clear that we can't expand fossil fuel infrastructure. We don't have this space anymore. There needs to be a hard line. I think we need to keep existing fossil fuels in the ground. We can't be investing in any more infrastructure in a dying economy. And then knowing the economic realities of communities being left behind in this kind of boom or bust cycle, we also need to be in the solutions that we're proposing, looking at how we're creating jobs, how we're addressing income inequality and more. And conveniently for us as organizers and advocates and folks new to the issue, a lot of that work has been done. So actually the job numbers are really clear, that there are many, many times more jobs created in a green and clean economy, and those jobs are more likely to be based in communities rather than requiring workers to do sort of intensive 10-day shifts far away from their homes and then fly back to see their kids and whatnot. So to the piece about the sort of better world that we want, I actually think, and not just I think, but all of the science and the policy work supports that communities will be better off with investments, but it can't just be that we don't build those projects and then we kind of leave everyone to fend for themselves, because that's not fair, and because that's not how we build broad movements and make those connections together. So it does need to be both and I just go back to the science gives us a very clear baseline for what is and isn't on the table in terms of where we go, and then we need to look at these questions of resource allocation and attention and decision making and who's benefiting, but recognizing that the baseline of carbon emissions isn't something we get to negotiate around. All of the rest we negotiate around, and we have debates about who should benefit, but the science is a clear bottom line.
That's a very good answer. Thank you. That's informative that you say the science is there supporting green energy for jobs and for the economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with what Christina said 100%. And I also, another piece that I think is really important to look at in the current context, and I know it has been true in Ontario and Quebec, and I think in BC as well, is part of what we've seen contributing so much to the spread of the coronavirus has had to do with the underfunding of our long-term care facilities. It has had to do with failure to regulate adequately and those kinds of things, and to begin to look at I mean, I know for a long time I would speak about green jobs as being in energy efficiency, renewable energy, public transportation, and those are all really important. But if we look at long-term care workers, if we look at nurses and doctors and teachers, and those are all very low emission jobs. And I think that those are things that the current crisis has illustrated, the current health crisis has illustrated really need supports and investment. And I mean, right now, as we're all navigating the back to school thing, that's probably also really, really clear and a real concern for a lot of people. In terms of the sense of overwhelm, one of the things that I would encourage you to do, Gladys, is to find people near you who share your concerns. There can be, I think there's real power in talking about these issues. It can certainly be overwhelming. But to stay sort of grounded in our place and in our community, I think can also be really valuable while you take action on all of the things that we've talked about, or the few that you feel able to address.
If I can just chime in as not in my moderator hat, but in my representative from Earthkeepers, Christians for Climate Justice hat. We're based in sort of Metro Vancouver, and so the topic about fossil fuel infrastructure expansion, with the pipelines and the tanker terminals, that's been happening right here in our own backyard as Earthkeepers. So for the past couple of years, we actually have dedicated some time to participating in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, with other sort of movements and other sort of civil society movements in opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion, precisely because, as Christine alluded to, we don't have the global carbon budget for continued fossil fuel infrastructure expansions. And as local sort of Christians here in Vancouver, we are the ones who are, locally placed to be able to participate in rallies or demonstrations and to just, demonstrate our support visibly. I also sort of agree with, both Carrie and Christine in saying that it's a both and we try not to be a group that is only against something, but we also try to be positive and for something. So over the past little while with the conversations around, what would economic renewal look like in Canada, we're also looking at ways to support local conversations here in Metro Vancouver around a Green New Deal and as part of a just renewal. So I'm hinting a little bit at what the next webinar will be like, but if you are looking for some further resources and information and sort of getting connected in Metro Vancouver, I encourage folks to just check out the Kinder Morgan section on the Earthkeepers webpage. We have a backgrounder where we've done some analysis, and we have some links for prayer where we can be praying actively for specific things in Metro Vancouver around fossil fuel expansion and some suggested activities.
Mm-hmm.
Really good question, though. It's always what do we do when we see something happening right in our backyard, and how do we put our attention, and where should we put our attention? So great questions. I think that's it for the questions that have been in the chat box. I just wanted to thank folks for staying an extra couple of minutes. There have been some very good substantive discussion that your questions have prompted. And I'm glad that we'll at least be able to, share the recording with others who've had to hop off earlier. So yeah, thank you for the questions, and really excellent conversations that we've been able to partake together today. And I'm just going to sort of shift us over into next steps and just share a couple of upcoming things you can be a part of, and then we'll turn to closing remarks. So I hinted at this about 30 seconds ago, but we are planning a fourth webinar. It's going to, dive even further down into what we can do in terms of local advocacy and organizing. We're still in the planning stages, and I've noticed that there are folks today linking in from Metro Vancouver and other parts of Canada. So I encourage you to sort of stay tuned to the communications coming out from this webinar and subscribe to the Earthkeepers mailing list. We were experimenting with kind of a smaller Metro Vancouver or smaller Vancouver Island organizing session, but we're certainly open to, if there's interest in, talking about local advocacy and organizing specifically in other regions, and people would be interested in connecting with us about those. We're happy to explore some other options. So stay tuned. The idea is that as we're moving from learning about COVID-19 and public health and the climate crisis, we want to be able to move more specifically along the spectrum of action towards things that we can do locally together as people of faith in the locales that we are currently placed. And in the meanwhile, next slide, please. Also invite you to join in our national sort of campaign for the Year of Prayer for Bold Climate Action. As both Carrie and Christine have mentioned, this decade is very critical for climate action because as humanity, we have been delaying climate action for a very long time. And we've talked a lot about action today. And the other sort of part of the advocacy life is also spending time in intercessory prayer and grounding our actions and our engagement in our trust in God, whom we believe in and whom we believe is ultimately the author and the one in control of everything happening. So we invite you to just join our campaign for the Year of Prayer. You'll find more details on the Earthkeepers website. We have specific prayer items that you can be praying for, and we also have a way to connect in with us just to let us know that there's a chain of Christians across the country praying for bold climate action. And any last housekeeping items is we'll be linking the information that's been shared from our panelists into a summary email for your use, so that you can sort of see all the resources and all the actions together in one link, and share that with your family, your friends, your church communities, and sort of continue the actions that we've been talking about today. And in closing, I just would like to invite invite Christine to share her closing comments.
Sure. I just wanted to encourage folks to, with my local government hat on, I guess, advocate on these issues at the local level. I early on as a city councillor got to witness, we had a kind of controversial proposal to City Hall for a new detox and recovery center in a residential neighborhood, which is the neighborhood I live in, and Grandview Calvary Baptist Church down the road from the proposed new site. So neighbors were nervous, and there was a lot of sort of stigma and fear around it. And the members of that congregation showed up at council, signed up to speak, brought in the voices of others who couldn't be there, speaking to why caring for our most struggling neighbors mattered so much to them as people of faith. And I just want to tell you that as a decision maker, it was incredibly impactful to hear all of these testimonies and folks showing up and waiting and speaking. And as a person of faith, it was one of the most powerful displays of faithful public witness that I have ever seen, to hear speaker after speaker, not proselytizing in a government building, but speaking about their own faith and why they were motivated to show up in support of this. It was really powerful. And so I think as we think about how we do faithful public witness and evangelism and social change, local government is a great example, because you can show up and speak and you get 2 minutes or you get 5 minutes on an issue. And we are all wrestling with climate issues because it actually is very central to how we design our communities. So would encourage you to look at what issues are on the table there, and at other levels too, but and then not be afraid to write to those decision makers or sign up to speak, and bring that faithful witness into it as a clear and personal reason why it matters to you so much. I think it's a really powerful opportunity. That's it. That's my last pitch. Push us and advocate to us. Yeah, we need your voices.
Thanks, Christine, and it's wonderful to sort of hear from someone who is now in the position to to hear from activists and Christians, and to be able to translate some of that into advocating for change in the public policy system. And if everyone will just join us in our closing prayer. I know we're at 7:17, so appreciate that everyone's been sticking around for an extra 20 minutes today. And I'd just like to invite us to close our time together in prayer. So if you will just join with me in prayer. Creator God, in the season of creation, we celebrate your goodness and faithfulness. We thank you for the opportunity to work alongside you in bringing about your kingdom. We lift up those who are suffering the most from the impacts of climate change, noting, for example, our neighbors in Sudan, Nigeria, and California, who have been directly and severely impacted this week. We also pray that you will guide our next steps collectively as people of faith here in BC, in Ontario, and beyond, as we work for justice and for the restoration and shalom of your creation. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we will see you either at the next webinar or meanwhile in the internet space. Take care, everyone. Have a good evening.